for Faith Leaders. This week's guest is Carmen Chu, the co-chair of the SF Economic Recovery Task Force. It is hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council and supported by the community branch of the San Francisco Emergency Operations Center at the EOC. Next slide, please. Just a couple of housekeeping tips to make your experience smooth today in our virtual environment. We are recording audio, video, and chat for record-keeping, training, and quality assurance purposes. By default, all participants will be muted and video turned off to minimize distractions. The chat is available for direct message to the community branch host of this event. And again, City Test SF is up and running. Anyone who lives or works in San Francisco experiencing COVID-19 symptoms can get tested. For more information, please go to sf.gov/citytestsf. And again, welcome to this week's SFIC weekly online briefing for faith leaders with our guest, Carmen Chu, the co-chair of the SF Economic Recovery Task Force. I would like to turn the floor over now to Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kristen, and I want to say a very special thank you to you. I know this is your last week with us. I think we've worked together 8 or 9 weeks on this together, and your efforts have been very much appreciated. Good morning.
Welcome, Michael.
Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this morning's online briefing for faith leaders. In addition to the widespread physical health repercussions of the coronavirus, the precautionary shelter-in-place measures have had a dramatic impact on the economy, sparking the closure of businesses, catalyzing unparalleled spikes in unemployment, as well as putting at risk access to food, housing, and healthcare for some of our most vulnerable residents. Anticipated city budget deficits over the next 2 years are estimated at $1.7 billion and higher, which means inevitable cuts in contracts, staff, and programs that provide the safety net for those who cannot care for themselves. In response, San Francisco Mayor London Breed and Board of Supervisors President Norman Yee called for the creation of the San Francisco Economic Recovery Task Force. The task force is charged with guiding the city's efforts through the coronavirus recovery, sustaining and reviving local businesses and employment, mitigating the economic hardships already affecting the most vulnerable San Franciscans, and building a resilient and equitable future. City Assessor-Recorder Carmen Chu, co-chair of the task force, will be the featured guest for this week's online briefing for faith leaders, hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council in collaboration with the Joint Information Center of the Department of Emergency Management. At this time, I would like to welcome a friend, colleague, and treasurer of the San Francisco Interfaith Council and outreach coordinator for the Joint Information Center, John McKnight, who has actually made these weekly online briefings possible to offer the opening interfaith statement and a few words of welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. The value of coming together as a community cannot be overexpressed, and I'm grateful for all of you for joining us, as well as for Carmen for joining us to give us some insight into what your office is doing to help with our economic recovery. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer a prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world. Welcome, everybody. And Michael, I return the floor to you.
Thank you very much, John. To ground us in a meditative moment, I want to welcome the president of the University of San Francisco, Father Paul Fitzgerald. Father Paul and I are the two faith representatives on the a San Francisco Economic Recovery Task Force. And I just want to say to Father Paul personally, thank you for your leadership and for the many collaborations that the San Francisco Interfaith Council and the University of San Francisco have shared together for the betterment of our city.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning to all my colleagues. I greatly appreciate the opportunity and am truly humbled by the responsibility of guiding the leadership of San Francisco's wonderfully diverse, mutually supportive, and hearteningly cooperative faith communities in a brief meditation this morning. My first impulse was to invite us to sit, breathe, and pray for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the time it took for Derek Chauvin to kill George Floyd. My segment of this morning's program is not that long, so I will take us through a shorter meditation, but I pray that we all find opportunities to do this with our communities. 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a bell tolling, of a community chanting, of folks weeping, is 8 minutes and 46 seconds of the Spirit of God enlightening our minds, breaking our hearts, and stiffening our spines for the work of justice and the labor of reconciliation. I am a Jesuit, and so this morning I have borrowed from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola, our founder. In the exercises, a 30-day program of prayers, meditations, and contemplations, Ignatius invites the retreatant to imagine encounters with God and then to reflect upon the emotions that were awoken during these times of prayer. Early in the retreat, Ignatius invites us to imagine a scene at the outset of the Christian tradition. We are to place ourselves in the company of the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They are surveying the totality of the human experience, with people being born, people learning trades, people falling in love, people running businesses, people being virtuous, people being sinful, people getting ill, and people dying. Then the Trinity decides that the Son should be incarnate and enter into the mess and confusion of the human reality with a preferential option for the poor, the marginalized, and those subject to injustice. So this is the meditation to which I invite you. Sit comfortably in your chair with your feet flat on the floor. Breathe deeply, slowly, and regularly. Imagine you have this great overview of the whole human race. And so see the babies being born into families of every race, creed, and culture. See the children of these same families of every nation, playing, learning, growing. See the young adults of humanity seeking a job, a chance to contribute to the common good. See these same people form families and join neighborhoods and communities. See those who are rejected and marginalized because of their race, religion, gender, or any other aspect of their noble humanity. See those who fall ill to pandemics, cancers, or industrial accidents. See those who grow old with or without the comfort of family and friends. See those who are dying, whether from a knee on their neck or no food in their house. And now ask God, who is loving, knowing, and good, but who has allowed a great deal of autonomy on this planet, to send us, along with his Son, into the full reality of humanity as God's agents, God's eyes, God's hands. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Father, for framing today's gathering. It is a great privilege to present today the City Assessor-Recorder, Carmen Chu. Carmen is no stranger to the work of the Interfaith Council. She has been an ally since her days on the Board of Supervisors and has collaborated and engaged the Council on a number of issues. I can think of no more worthy co-chair of the San Francisco Economic Recovery Task Force than City Assessor Carmen Chu. Carmen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, and to everybody who is here today. I see a lot of friends who I haven't personally seen in quite some time, so it's good to see all of your faces and to be able to join you this morning. To Michael, to Father Paul Fitzgerald, to Roma Guy, who I see on the call also, I want to thank you for participating and for working with us on the Economic Recovery Task Force. It is a big job ahead, and so I want to thank you first and foremost for that. You know, I want to thank Father Paul Fitzgerald for your wonderful meditation and for asking us all to reflect on what we had seen over the last few weeks, and I think for many people have experienced for a lifetime. And I just want to say that I think all of us are grappling with how it is that we can individually make sure that we helped the city and our communities to heal and to move forward. For myself, just for folks who may not know, I serve as San Francisco's elected assessor. The role that I'm playing on the Economic Recovery Task Force is actually something that's above and beyond that role. Typically, we would never be in this situation, but I think a pandemic makes us all lift ourselves up and really figure out how we can do more to help the city. And so it is a role that I gladly take to try to help our city move forward. When I think about kind of where we are at this point, you know, so before I was assessor, I served on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. And the reason I got into public service to begin with actually brings me back to a time when I was a little girl, when I was living in Southern California with my parents. And we had in 1992, I think it was, or four, the Los Angeles riots. My parents had a home actually, or a restaurant in South Central Los Angeles. And on those days of the riots, I can remember a lot of fear, a lot of worry, in particular as my parents were held up at gunpoint and were particularly impacted by those, by the unrest. And I remember even as a little girl at that time, what it meant to think about societal structures and what opportunities or lack of opportunities we had in so many of our communities, much less institutional racism and violence that are perpetrated. And so, you know, I just simply want to say that as this, you know, the last few weeks have kind of really caused many of us to reflect, I do think that there is a mixture of both hopelessness sometimes, because, you know, that happened 30 years ago, and sometimes it feels like we're running and we're in the same place. But what I hope is real hope, and where I find light is that so many of us are talking about it. So many of us are taking personal action and really reflecting to take that personal responsibility to say, how do we in each of our lives live that creed, and how do we move our communities forward together? So I do hope that this is going to move San Francisco and move the nation forward. I know there are a lot of forces that would hope that that's not true, but I think justice overall will prevail. And I want to thank the Interfaith Council for your steadfast leadership. People seek you for healing. They seek you for prayers, for guidance. And I just want to thank you in advance for the role that you play in comforting our communities and really to help provide that moral leadership to our communities. So thank you again for those words in the morning, and I'm glad to be with you all. So I'm going to now turn to economic recovery, and I think it's a big deal, and I'm going to share a screen with you and hopefully run through the PowerPoint relatively quickly so that I can make time to provide answers to questions that you might have. Can everybody see that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So my name is Carmen Chu, and again, I am serving on the Economic Recovery Task Force as a co-chair. I'm co-chairing the effort alongside with Treasurer Jose Cisneros, with the head of the Labor Council, Rudy Gonzalez, with our Chamber of Commerce head, Rodney Fong. All of us are really together to try to figure out how it is that we put San Francisco in the best place forward for economic recovery. So I have a few slides to go through with you. Hopefully it provides some context to how it is that San Francisco is thinking about economic recovery and reopening of activities. But not only that, you can also understand where the task force is going in terms of the focus of our work in the coming months. Okay. So I think as many people have been watching the news, you do know overall kind of what the trajectory of COVID-19 has been in the city. We know that because of San Francisco's early actions, we were able to truly flatten the curve together. And I think as a result, because we did not see the same level of surge that inundated hospital systems in the East Coast, we were able to provide better care, I believe. And I think the mortality rates that you see here reflect that better care or that ability to provide better care during COVID-19. But I think just as difficult as it was for the city to enter into a situation where we went into shelter in place, something that none of us have ever experienced, or many of us have not experienced, I think being able to reopen the economy is also proving to be infinitely difficult. Not only because of all the new rules or new thinking that has to go into place with how it is that you open up an economy, knowing that you have COVID-19 amongst us, but also how do you stage that? What are the risks and considerations we should be thinking about? I like sharing this graph with people because I think it's an interesting one that shows a little bit about the relationship between economic activity or general activity in our communities and society and what the reproduction rate is. So if you take a look at the chart here, the jagged line, the jagged blue line represents a mobility index. It's provided by an organization called SafeGraph. They make this information publicly available. Essentially, it is a measure of economic or movement or mobility within San Francisco. You can see that prior to the shelter-in-place order in March, that there was relatively high levels of mobility within our city. And then as shelter-in-place was implemented, you saw that that dropped off precipitously so that we have a much lower rate in terms of mobility across the city. Why mobility is important is because the more people there are moving in about the city, where they're going shopping or doing different activities, the more possibility there is for interactions between people or contact between people. You see that there is a connection with that the RE bar that you see. This is called the reproduction rate, or sometimes you hear it referred to as R naught. That essentially is the level at which COVID-19 is reinfecting other individuals. So the way that you read that is when you have an R naught of 3.3, a person who has COVID-19 is on average spreading COVID-19 to 3.3 individuals. You can see that over time in San Francisco, that R naught has dropped from a more natural reoccurring infection rate of 3.3 to roughly 0.85. The number here that a lot of epidemiologists look at is the number 1. If you are below 1, essentially COVID-19 eventually dies out. If you are above 1, you have the potential chance for a resurgence or an increase in the number of people infected. Now, this just shows you the relationship between movement in the economy or movement in general and the possibility or the reproduction rate of COVID-19. What it's not really factoring in and what it's not distinguishing for you is what is the role that our individual actions have in terms of reducing the reproduction rate. And so, for example, when we do the tough work of making sure that we social distance, when we wear facial coverings, when we make sure that we continue to wash our hands, these are all things that actually contribute to the reduction in COVID-19 spreading. So although the mobility in San Francisco contributed partially to the drop in R naught, certainly all of these other things also did. And so I only raise this because it's really important as we think about when we reopen the economy, we're going to introduce all of a sudden much more mobility into our city. So we really need to then be vigilant about these 3 things in order to make sure that we try to keep this R naught number down. When you take a look at these numbers, you may say, well, in San Francisco, that's great. We flattened the curve, so things are mostly okay, right? But in fact, I think the city's response has been that we need to continue to make sure that we're prepared and ready for any possible resurgence of COVID-19. This is important because even though we have flattened the curve, we haven't eliminated COVID-19. To date, there is no vaccine or widespread treatment of COVID-19. And so it's really important for us to remember this. And so San Francisco continues to have an activated emergency operations center at the Moscone Center. We're continuing to coordinate across our different hospitals, continuing to ramp up contact tracing, testing, and making sure that we have enough PPE or personal protective equipment for our frontline workers. And not only that, continuing to work to make sure that we're providing for quarantine space, meeting people's basic needs in terms of food and shelter, among other things. And of course, I think the one area that we know that we have to be constantly careful about are our congregated living facilities. When DPH, Department of Public Health, talks about what a recovery may look like, I think this one is really important to know that it's very much different from some of the economic recoveries that we've had in the past. You know, for example, coming back from the Great Recession or other dot-com bust, it's much different because we don't expect this to be a linear recovery. A few things is true is that we know that it's possible that, again, that COVID-19 can resurge if we're not careful with social distancing and some of these other measures that help to prevent spread. I think especially because we know that COVID-19 is, because it has a longer incubation period, there's also, it makes it much more infectious because sometimes people don't know when they have it and might spread it. And I think the other thing that is important to know is that when we take a look at the example of recent flu pandemics, typically the duration of time it lasts is about 18 to 24 months. So this tells us a few things. It tells us that our recovery potentially will go through ups and downs because we're going to see potentially waves of recurrence. Number two, we know that this is an infectious disease, so it has a high potential to take off. And number three, we also know that it'll be with us for a duration of time. The one bright spot in this is that because of its global impact, we've also seen an unprecedented level of investment in research and development for both vaccines as well as treatments. To date, from what we see in the Chronicle, they've said that there are over 130 vaccine efforts underway, in addition to over 200 efforts to create effective treatments for COVID-19. And so hopefully with all of that energy and all of that research and I think a higher level of collaboration in our research R&D fields, we might be able to break that cycle and hopefully get through this a little bit faster than we normally would compared to other flu pandemics. And so as we think about how it is that San Francisco is then approaching reopening, there are a few fundamental building blocks to our approach. And here I've laid out what those concepts are. So it is a complex picture, but it's important just to know what's underlying the decisions. Number one, state phasing. It serves as a building block for us, but there is a recognition that although the state might provide either timelines or guidance, San Francisco may want to take a more conservative approach because we want to make sure that we are taking a look at the on-the-ground health indicators that are prevalent here in the city. And there's also a recognition that San Francisco is a dense urban area. And so it is very different from many parts of the state of California. The second key concept is that the health department is looking at reopening the economy through different gates and in increments. And the reason for that is that as they open different sectors and different parts of the economy, they want to make sure that they're watching the health indicators so that they are not opening everything up all at once and seeing an immediate huge surge that they can't pull back. Third point is that they are looking at activities from low risk to high risk, factoring in the fact that you can mitigate some of the ways that we provide services, and know that we're going to have to change how we do and deliver our businesses or our services going forward, at least for the interim period. Number four, we did take a look at hard hit sectors and sectors that were able to operate remotely. So that was an important piece of how we looked at it. We also recognize that there are certain sectors that though they may be perceived as higher risk, are also fundamental building blocks or fundamental pieces of an economy working. So these are things, I think, for anybody who has or knows of a family who has a young child at home, childcare, education, transportation. Truthfully, for parents we're seeing a lot of parents who are really struggling to work at home when they also have to do distance learning and other things with their children at home. And so we understand that there are some sectors that are really critical underpinnings for an economy to work. The next is that we have put out forward a roadmap to allow people to plan ahead. We know that when we open up the economy, people can't just flip the switch and open their businesses again. It takes time to procure the things that they need to make sure that their workers and customers are safe, and it takes time to plan forward. So we wanted to make sure that people had a forward-looking view of what San Francisco was thinking, recognizing that that roadmap can also change and shift depending on either new health information or on new state guidance that comes out or state timing that changes. And finally, San Francisco understands that we are not an island and that we do have people who move in and about the Bay Area. And so what that means is that we're also watching out to see what's happening in Alameda County or San Mateo County, because some of our workers are coming from different parts of the Bay Area and vice versa, our residents are going to different places as well. So what do we mean as the state? What do we mean about the concept state phasing as a building block? So as I think many people have probably been hearing, and I know that it is very confusing in general because you're hearing about what the state is doing, what San Francisco is doing, and then what a neighboring county is doing, and they might all sound very different. So the best way to describe it is this. The state of California has bucketed different economic activities or different activities into 4 different phases. In phase 1, they call that sort of the recovery phase. Those are just essential businesses. And then from phase 2 to phase 3, they go from low risk activities to higher risk activities. And then in phase 4, that's when they contemplate opening up the economy entirely, meaning that a vaccine has been found or very effective treatments have been found. The way that San Francisco would move through this is that we would take a look at the bucketed items, generally the allowable activities within a particular phase that the state is in, and then we may not open them all at once, but we may end up opening them in different phases within that period of time. It is also possible that we would move slower than the state, depending on whether our health indicators are supporting us to move forward or not. And so, again, I think that really goes to this point, which is we want to make sure that we're monitoring our health indicators to let us know whether we should continue and move to opening the next tranche, should we stay put, or potentially if we have to move back. So this is going to be very small print, but I will share the slide deck with you so you'll have it. It's also available on our website at the city, and you see the link there. Just know that this is the link is to San Francisco's reopening roadmap, and that roadmap can change over time, and we do expect it to change over time. These are activities that are already open prior to June 15. So June 15 is sort of the next tranche. So this is the thing, these are the things that you should be aware are open. So all essential businesses have already been open, but the newer things that got added were things like curbside retail for products. We opened up manufacturing and warehouse and logistics, elective surgeries, etc. I think the big thing here is that daycare was also opened up prior to June 15. And you'll see also in terms of activities, many of the activities you see there are low contact outdoor type activities. In mid-June, which is around June 15, we're expecting to see a whole next set or tranche of different activities and businesses be allowed or permitted to open. You're going to see that outdoor dining was moved up actually to this Friday to allow that to happen more quickly. Following pretty closely behind that in the next early next week on Monday are things like indoor retail, extending to all curbside retail, so not just for products but also for services, among other items. You'll note lower on the activities section, religious gatherings and ceremonies are also slated for a mid-June opening, but of course with limitations that the Department of Public Health will articulate soon. In mid-July, we expect that hair salons and barbershops will open, indoor dining, and real estate with open houses. In mid-August, you can see sort of the next slate of activities that would be slated to open. All of these, I think, for folks to know, it doesn't mean that when we say reopen, that they open as they did before COVID-19. I think all of these businesses will have to open, and all of these activities all have to open with the concept of social distancing, using face covering, and practicing good hygiene or cleanliness are all fundamental building blocks, especially in a COVID reality. I think the other thing for folks to know is that the full reopening is when we are at a place where we would allow for mass gatherings and things like concerts, live audience, sports and performances, festivals, those kinds of high contact, high volume, long duration type activities. So folks might wonder just generally why is it, for example, that you see mid-July has so few bucketed items, and why is it that it's heavily loaded in mid-June or mid-August? Well, the truth is that we were trying to coincide and connect up this timing based on state phasing. So remember, we talked about how state phasing serves as a building block. The one thing to know is that for now, San Francisco is not a county that has been granted permission to vary from the state's plan. And so as a result, we can only move slower than the state in terms of permitted activities, but we can't move faster than it. So these gatings and this bucketing really reflects trying to understand how it is that the state would be opening over time. To give you a sense, this is what the states has shared with us in terms of their opening. This is really truly about as much information we have. So you would think that there might be more detail behind what people mean with entertainment venues or other things, but it really is more broad and general in terms of their guidance at the moment in terms of activities. Currently, we are actually in something called early phase 2, according to the state. So you'll see that the things that we've allowed to open are pretty close to this, right? Curbside retail, manufacturing, logistics, childcare, and so on. Religious services, I highlighted here because before Memorial Day, religious services or in-person religious services were actually in phase 3 of the state's plan. So that has shifted actually relatively recently. This is what I mean by the state is changing its guidance and information. Meanwhile, our expanded phase 2 sort of coincides, if you can imagine, with June 15. Our phase 3 items typically are connected to the July time period, and then we break up the July to an August time period as well. I have these areas that are highlighted in gray because, as I said, the state is constantly moving in terms of its guidance and where they're bucketing things. They're moving things from one phase to the next or earlier, sometimes without a whole lot of notice. The areas in gray are areas where they have actually allowed counties that have been given the authority to vary from the state's plan permission to move these items upwards. So it really helps it feeds for us a little bit of thinking about how the state is thinking about risk. And so we try as much as we can to factor and infer from these actions as we can for our local plan. Meanwhile, remember that I spoke about how the city will be looking at health indicators to decide whether or not we're moving to the next gate. Here are some of the things that the Bay Area counties all together are monitoring and sharing with each other. Essentially, the questions that they are trying to ask before they open up gates are a few things. They want to know if they're able to handle a surge or increase in cases. And so the metrics here around hospital capacity and PPE supply get to that question. They are also wondering if they're going to be able to detect the spread of COVID-19 in a very quick way. And so the indicators like surveillance and like testing get to that question. And finally, they're also asking questions about, once we know that someone has COVID-19, are we able to manage that spread and to prevent it from from spreading too much. And that is where that last indicator, contact tracing, comes in. It's trying to understand, do we have enough resources to be able to follow up with people and to effectively understand who else might have been infected. So these are the health indicators that the Bay Area counties are all collecting. They're also sharing and making this available to each other so that we are aware of what's happening in other counties. We've seen an interesting increase in cases in Alameda County and San Mateo. I believe we're hearing some interesting numbers there as well. So now for the Economic Recovery Task Force, as I mentioned, all of that is context for us because we've been working very, very hard to do a number of things. We were convened towards the end of April, so we've actually been as a group coming together for a little bit, about a month and a half, or actually no, month and a half. Yes, about a month and a half now. It seems like it's such a long amount of time that has passed already. And for the beginning, we really did a lot of work to listen to our task force members, to convene them in small groups so we can hear back about what they're experiencing on the ground and areas where they want us to focus. We've also taken in hundreds and hundreds of different emails and surveys that people have actually submitted to us by internet and consolidated that information to really understand how it is that we should be focusing our work that meets the needs of people who've reached out to us. And so once we consolidated that information, here were the three areas in which we were focusing. One was around facilitating a safe reopening. Ultimately, the question that many of policymakers and local folks have been asking are how do we support our local businesses? How do we help people who are out of jobs? How do we help with the economic insecurity that we're seeing in our city? And one of the ways that we can do that is to facilitate the reopening of our economy, to get businesses back online, to be able to get people employed in some of those businesses. It's not the only solution, and frankly, there were a lot of disparities in our economy that existed before then, but it is one thing that we can be doing to start kickstarting back the economy. And so in that work, we've been working very, very hard with the Department of Public Health on a number of things. One, to create even that roadmap that you saw earlier in order for there to be some advanced information and thinking to businesses and to residents about what might be coming ahead. We think that that was incredibly important to set the groundwork for people to plan and to prepare. And then now we're also working very closely with sectors to make sure that we are allowing them to be able to view drafts of what the Department of Public Health is thinking in terms of directives, because I think admittedly the Department of Public Health has a lot of really professional and great people who are thinking about health and the spread of disease. They may not know how different types of businesses operate and whether some of the things that they're suggesting they do or recommending they do would actually be impossible to carry out on the ground. And so it's really important to make sure that we marry up those perspectives so that we can have the best policies possible that are also realistic and will have much more compliance because people can actually do it. So that's what we've been working on very, very much in the month of May. We also shared with the task force at that time that in the month of June, we would start to pivot to 2 other areas as well. And those are really on the development of interim and long-term solutions for San Francisco to be considering for economic recovery. In terms of the midterm, because we know that COVID-19 will be with us for a period of time, we really want to be thinking about how do we build an interim economy that's going to be resilient? How do we help workers and encourage workers to be able to get tested if they feel sick and to self-quarantine without fear of losing a job, for example? How do we make sure that businesses are able to weather potentially the ups and downs and to know that there are going to be different restrictions that are going to be put into place that will limit how they can actually do their work? In terms of the long term, we also know that COVID-19 is really changing the way that we're thinking about how we do our work. So many more people are now telecommuting. There's been a lot of articles written about what's going to happen to office spaces and these high-rise buildings. So there's been a lot of conversation generally about how we use our space, how we imagine even our public spaces and the usage of that. I think a lot of people saw a great benefit to the environment, especially when people stopped using their cars so much. So I think there's a lot of questions around not only how do we kind of create and better use our space, but how do we build a San Francisco that is going to be more equitable in the future, and really helps to prop up all of our communities. This is a really aspirational goal that we want to make sure that we're not forgetting to focus on, because it is important for how we think about the future. So I mentioned earlier that this is sort of the upcoming focus. We are going to be, in terms of the long-term and intermediate, we're going to be looking at 4 main pillars, which is jobs and business support, vulnerable populations, economic development, arts, culture, hospitality, and entertainment. So I'm going to just go through these very, very quickly and not spend too much time on it. But again, for jobs and businesses, it's about how we ensure that the businesses survive and what is it that we need for San Franciscans to get back to work. For vulnerable populations, we want to know how it is that we're going to help our most vulnerable communities survive through COVID-19 and also to thrive post-COVID-19. In terms of economic development, I spoke a little bit about that. What are those long-term changes that we think that we want to pursue, not only in the usage of space, but how we invest our money, what kind of economy we try to support, and the diversity of industry and different opportunities for people. And then finally, the one I didn't speak too much about is arts, culture, hospitality, and entertainment. As you all know, entertainment, tourism is a very big part of San Francisco. You know, we have a thriving arts and cultural kind of city that I think is part of the reason why people love being here. It's diverse, it has this wonderful feel to it and a lot of great things that happen here. But at the same time, because of the way COVID-19 spreads and the risk associated with it, many of these activities like our festivals, like tourism in general returning, is something that probably won't happen very quickly or very immediately. And so how do we support and continue to support this important part of San Francisco, knowing that we're going to have a challenge with implementation or it coming back for a period of time? Here is the last piece I will end with is just economic recovery on San Francisco. And so I've talked a lot about the impact in terms of the broader private economy, but whatever is happening in the private economy also has a very deep impact in terms of San Francisco government's operations. And in particular, we're seeing pretty significant impacts to our revenues. We're seeing really big losses in many of our top line revenue sources for the city, and we expect that to continue through the next year. We're also seeing, of course, an increased level of expenditures from new programs that are being put in place, rightly so, to really help people through this tough time. So that's an added pressure to San Francisco's operations and budget. And meanwhile, we're still responding to COVID-19. And so currently, I think we're probably at about $300 million in terms of surge expenses that we're incurring. For the most part, we expect most of that to be able to be reimbursed by FEMA. But to the extent that the Trump administration at some point says that the emergency is over, there will be no longer any reimbursement to local jurisdictions at a time when all of us are still going to be responding to the potential resurgence of COVID for a long time. Finally, I think as many of you are probably aware, we are part of the state of California, and when they have a budget cut or budget shortfall, which they do, it often flows downstream to local counties. Here's just a quick high-level look in terms of San Francisco's budget. Again, I mentioned our biggest losses in general fund sources on the revenue side were hotel taxes, sales tax, and business tax. So there is a really tied connection to how well businesses and the larger economy is doing and what it is that San Francisco has in terms of resources to do the work that we do. Bottom line is that over the 3-year period, next year, the year after, and this current year, we expect to see a $1.7 billion budget deficit. The bright spot in this is that over the last few years, we have really put a concerted effort into putting away money during the good times in reserves. We have $630 million roughly in rainy day and stabilization reserves, as well as another 150 in general fund reserve, which is very positive. It's actually at the highest level we've ever had them in the city. We're glad that we've done that because look at that $1.7 billion budget deficit. It will help to soften the impact, but it certainly won't get us all the way there. And then in terms of where we're going next in terms of the city's budget, our interim budget is currently operational. Well, it will be operational July 1. Our fiscal year, remember, goes from July 1 through June 30th of every year. Instead of a June 1st submission, which the mayor usually does, it's going to be pushed back to a August 1 submission. And the purpose of that is because there was so much uncertainty around revenues in general that it made no sense to build a budget off of numbers that you didn't know if there was any validity to it. No matter what, a budget has a lot of assumptions, including what people believe will come in for revenue, but we really had so much uncertainty, especially in those early months, that it did not make sense for us to be able to submit a budget at that time. So again, during the August 1 submission, the mayor will be working with departments to close a $1.7 billion gap in order to propose a balanced budget to the board. In her instructions, she's asked for 10% cuts from every department, plus another 5% potentially that would be accelerated if necessary. And these are anticipated to be ongoing cuts. In September, so the board will deliberate the budget in the month of August. The board would fully approve that in September, and then if it all passes well, then October 1st would be the first day that that budget will be operational. So this concludes my presentation. It's been a lot of information. I hope that it was useful information, and I'm happy to answer questions that you might have on the slides or any other topics that you might have.
Carmen, thank you very much. And just so you know, we will be disseminating this presentation to our 5,000 e-subscribers so they can watch it at their leisure, but it's been very, very helpful. I did want to mention that since the Great Recession, the San Francisco Interfaith Council has been convening the CEOs of the major faith-based social service agencies. And we've navigated them through the budget cuts of that time, through the displacement of nonprofits during the tech boom, and now looking also before the pandemic at recruitment and retention of staff, all structural matters that are going to impact the economy moving forward. Roma Guy and I both serve on the Vulnerable Persons subcommittee, and so we thought today it would be a really great idea if we could present to you 3 CEOs of our faith-based social service agencies, just to share very briefly how they've been impacted and to ask you a question. And we'll begin with Kaushik Roy, who's also the chairman of the board of the Interfaith Council, but he is the executive director of the Shanti Project.
Yep.
Thank you, Michael. Carmen, it's Kaushik. It's good to see you. It's been a while. Thank you for joining us. I say that with our the Interfaith Council hat on. We really do appreciate the time and information, but I was asked really to have my Shanti hat on and sharing a few thoughts and getting your thoughts on a couple of items. I'm a bit biased, but I will say I think San Francisco should be very, very proud of its community-based safety net. I think to every organization I know, once the mayor's first announcements for sheltering in place happened, all the safety net nonprofits did a couple of things. One, of course, was to make sure paramount that their staff safety was ensured, as well as their clients. But then we also all identified those most at risk within our client populations and made sure our essential services would still continue, while also, I think, jumping to the forefront of how we could all address the new challenges of COVID-19. So I don't think I know of a partner organization that's not doing more now than it did 3 months ago or so, because everyone's trying to do what they usually do, plus serve folks with COVID-19 who were affected by it. So I'll use that as a segue to what I want to ask you. Before COVID-19, there really was felt an existential threat. I think one of the most paramount issues for us was, as nonprofits, the sustainability for a lot of our organizations, as Michael mentioned. And this has become a much greater and greater challenge over the last few years. The community-based model is set up where, unfortunately, especially frontline service folks just do not get paid enough, even under the best of circumstances. And given all the cost of living issues in this area, I think all of us have been losing more and more staff, and even those who are here are moving further and further away, and it's harder to continue. And then, of course, you have a pandemic and a situation unlike any other in our lifetimes hitting that already, I think, fragile point of view. Interestingly, I don't think for a lot of nonprofits, this crisis moment is where we most feel the economic pressures we're going to. I think we were very fortunate that the mayor agreed to and has extended all the nonprofit contracts through this fiscal year and the beginning of the next one during the interim budget process. And I think a lot of us were also very fortunate to have longtime donors who understood what we were doing and were able to step up. But these are temporary fixes, of course. I think the concern for a lot of us is what it's going to look like in 12 months from now, or 12 to 24 months from now. And it's hard to picture San Francisco's community-based safety net not looking a lot different. And what I mean by that is by being smaller and a lot of us not being here because of the economic realities. So what I'd love to get some thoughts from you on, one is, I feel like our sector sees the iceberg on the horizon, but what is it we should be doing? What should we be saying and to whom? And I don't think that's just to the electeds. I think also the general community doesn't necessarily have an awareness of the impact nonprofits make, not just on the safety net, but on the economy. I'd love to hear anything you have to share on the task force's role, or how you see it in terms of the nonprofit sector in particular. I noticed in one of your slides when you talked about vulnerable populations, nonprofits were not on that list of the subpoints that you're focusing on, which I think should be. And I know we have I know Brett and Sherilyn and other nonprofit leaders are on that task force. But I think most of the, not that I like to speak for others, but I think a lot of the EDs really feel in short, there has to be some intentionality in the next year or two, or the city's going to see a much different landscape for community-based safety net nonprofits. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on those questions or anything else related to that.
Yeah, I mean, such a huge question and so many things to say about it. I think first and foremost, I think it was very intentional that we did include many of our nonprofit partners on the task force. And so the task force has a wide variety of folks from different sectors, whether it's small and large business, different types of businesses, neighborhoods, but also we've made sure and we're intentional to include nonprofits and foundations and others in the task force as well, so that we can have that perspective. I think the thing about nonprofits in general is that you sort of sit in this in-between world, right? Because you're not totally private because you're not money-making endeavors or those types of businesses, and you're not government either, right? And so two of the major focus areas for the city right now is sort of government services and what's happening in the private sector. And you kind of straddle both of those worlds because you work with the city in terms of being our partner on so many things. And at the same time, you do have sort of your own needs in terms of having to fundraise on your own to make the rest of your operations work. I think you're really right. So in terms of the vulnerable communities and populations, you're right. In particular, because we've thought a lot about, in general, nonprofit organizations and how it is that, that's my husband, how it is that we've, I mean, over time, the last few years, I mean, there's been a lot of conversations also about nonprofits potentially losing and having really expensive rental costs and other things that have been driving space away, those kinds of things too. So I agree with you that it's definitely a part of what we should be addressing within our vulnerable communities section. So I don't disagree with you at all. I think that should be a focus for us as well. I think you're astute to say that, you kind of see the tip of the iceberg, and the fact that right now the short-term solutions might be holding people up, but that over time you're going to see a pretty big challenge. And I think that is true. A few things. It really does depend on how our economy recovers and at what pace we do that. It's really crazy because, there's a lot of conversation about economic recession and so on, but you've also seen some crazy, unexplainable things like our stock markets rebounding a certain way, right? So it's not really sort of lining up. The economy overall is not lining up the way that we think that it should in so many aspects. But to your point, what worries me very much is that, I mean, I sit on the board of SPUR as well, and one of the things that we've been talking about on that side is also this understanding that so many of our entities that have been funding the organizations, it's a nonprofit, are also not going to have the ability to fund us at the level that they have in a long time. So it's forcing us to have very serious conversations around what that looks like for the longer period of time. So the longer that we are in a prolonged kind of recession and a deep recession, if we have that, it's going to be more challenging for, I think, nonprofits who do depend on fundraising and private fundraising to be able to make ends meet. I guess when I kind of think about how it is that we want to be thinking about this, I mean, all of the questions or all of the points that you raised earlier, the difficulty with retaining employees, in particular in this high cost area. We understand that, and I know that that is why the city has over time done some work in terms of COLA increases. So that's been part of that conversation. But I try to think about, well, what did we do? What happened in the Great Recession? And what will that look like? How will we kind of move past this? I mean, it is at a level that is unprecedented. So during the Great Recession, for example, we had probably a combined budget deficit of roughly 800 million in 2 years. And so to be at a $1.7 billion budget deficit is significantly more. We are better off in terms of reserves than we were before, so that's positive. But at the same time, it's not going to be without some sacrifices and cuts. And so, you know, during that time, we saw a lot of nonprofits who ended up merging, right? Who ended up joining either with other ones or ended up going away. And I think that's incredibly unfortunate because it will come at exactly the time when San Franciscans most need your help, right? And I think that is the nature of economic downturns as well, because just as the city's budget is contracting, it's also the time when when people most need government to also respond to. So I don't have an easy answer for you, but you know, I think all of us are going to be looking, at least on the city side, about how it is that we can try to trim anything that is discretionary first, because we do understand that our nonprofit partnerships are really important. It's about serving our communities just as much as we serve our communities. So I think there is that recognition. We're going to be doing the hard work to figure out all of those expenses that were nice to have, but we can no longer do. We're also going to be cutting back a lot of things that, like training and other things that are just simply not going to happen, especially because we're not going to be able to get together for things. So I think we're going to do a lot of that work, that tough work to come. You know, in terms of thinking about the long term for nonprofits, I don't know what it's going to look like in terms, it's just a thought, but I don't know what the real estate market is going to look like in the coming year and a half or so. But I would closely watch that. And also, if you are a nonprofit that has the wherewithal to, I know that it doesn't sound like it's the right thing to do in terms of investing in property, but you know, I know that so much of people's inability sometimes to be able to manage expenses because you have, you know, fixed expenses like rent and other things that are just skyrocketing, right? So I would just say that to the extent that there are any opportunities to be able to make some long-term investments that create stability for the organization in the long term, these are things you might want to be exploring as nonprofits. To the extent that the city might even be able to assist with some of that, you know, I think that's something that's worth thinking about as well. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank
So
you.
sorry that it was so long-winded, but there's so
No,
much.
no, no, no.
There's so much to say.
No,
I'm in
there is.
the
If I just add
unenviable
one thing,
position.
Michael, real quickly. I was remiss in saying this earlier. I should have said that nonprofits in the city are very fortunate to have the government that we do on a city level. I think the partnerships and the openness and the concern the city shows is very unique given other places in the country. So I should have said that earlier. Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you. I'm in the unenviable position of being timekeeper.
Oh, sorry,
I know
talking too long.
We have two other panelists who I want to make sure that we give time to, so I would urge gently and with love, economy of words. Next we have Nancy Nielsen, Deputy Director of Lutheran Social Services.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Hi. First, Carmen, thank you so much. I almost hate to ask anything or any question without having time to totally digest everything you've given us, because it was a masterful presentation. So thank you very much. I also thank you for your remarks and opening and helping us understand the context that we're all in, which I think as nonprofits working with vulnerable populations, we can't ever let go of. From Father Paul's introduction, grounding us in what we're all feeling now, the fear, the revulsion, the horror of the death of George Floyd, the ongoing deep fear of, particularly in our senior communities and our families, of COVID, the fear that my life has totally changed, I'll never hug my grandchildren again, what am I going to do? That context for all of us, and the separation from family and friends. And I particularly feel this with the staff And when we're working with vulnerable populations, we can't lose sight of the fact that the staff who come in and try to do that work, to walk alongside, to accompany people in these times, are themselves dealing with all of these impacts and fears. When you have to have grandma yelling at you every day that you leave to go to work because you might bring the virus home to her, or you might bring it home to your children, this is such a daily tangible fear for everybody. And yet we still do the work. We're still committed to doing the work. The most for my hat as a nonprofit service provider right now, my biggest concern is that when we talk in broad terms of serving vulnerable populations, that we never lose sight of the fact that that cohort of vulnerable people is surrounded by the service providers who are trying to help them through this time. So when budget decisions and changes are made, that it is that larger picture of the whole circle of who is trying to sustain those populations. So I know there are tough times ahead with our budgets, and that's a long-term conversation for the next few months, but I simply want to hold that up to say this context, while half the population is excited about, oh boy, I can go to a restaurant again, I can go out, I can do all these things, that basic context of fear is not leaving for most people. And that's what we have to wend our way through. So thank you for all you do. Thank you.
Okay. We will move on then to Mario Paz, Executive Director of Good Samaritan Family Resource Center. So we've gone from the Tenderloin now to the mission. Mario?
Sorry, myself.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Carmen. It's great to see you. Let me just start off by saying is I can't think of a better public servant that is helping guide us in the city through the economic recovery, and I join my colleagues in thanking you for your leadership and others. Carmen, during your presentation, I think there was an acknowledgement, recognition that there were many vulnerable communities before the COVID-19 crisis that were already struggling in our city. And what this pandemic has surfaced and shown us is the deep structural inequalities that continue to sort of challenge our city. And, you know, we recognize that there are communities such as the Latinx population in San Francisco that have been disproportionately impacted by the socioeconomic factors that exacerbate COVID-19 infection rates and their consequences. And we wonder and we hope that, and we look to how we can work together to figure out how we can support these communities as they seek assistance from the city of San Francisco now and through our collective recovery. And I know this will not be an easy journey for us. We know we're facing many more hardships ahead. Many of the solutions that have been proposed are still sort of short-term, right? They're sort of dealing with the immediate crisis. But as Kaushik said, we're looking, as leaders, we're looking 1 year, 2 years ahead like you are. Yeah. And so, again, I want to thank you for the leadership, and also to the task force for recognizing that there are real inequalities and there are communities that, again, have been disproportionately impacted both through this pandemic and the economic consequences. And what can we do as a city to ensure that that every community can in the future thrive and be successful in San Francisco? Thank you, Carmen.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think both your comments are very well taken, and Nancy's as well, because, you know, when we think about our vulnerable communities, it's not just one blanket statement. There are a lot of there's a lot of nuances within our communities. I mean, everybody from the people who are not able to shelter in place because they have to go work, right? And they don't have the option to work from home, for example, who end up being much more exposed to COVID-19 and the possibility of catching it than anybody else. I think that truly is being exacerbated and played out in this time. You know, I think Nancy had mentioned our seniors who, even though for many people they are returning to some kind of economic activity, for many of our seniors, this continues to be a very dangerous disease, and there are truly impacts with regard to mental health and social isolation that we have to be thinking about as well. So I just want you to know that I can't imagine how we're going to be able to do this without the trusted partnership with many of you, and as well as our nonprofits, because it is the place and the way that people have most connected. Everybody who's on this call, as well as our nonprofits, are trusted resources for our community as well. So I think we're really looking to try to figure out, how do we try to crack this nut? You know, the issue about inequality has been with us for a very long time. Who gets to benefit from economic growth? We've seen it be completely uneven in this last recovery, right? And so what are the ways, are there ways for us to be systemically thinking about how do you try to flip that? And I don't know that you know, in our system, I'm not sure what that will look like, but I think we have to try. We have to try to figure out what that will look like. Right, and part of it is saying, how do we help our nonprofits survive, number one, so that they can actually continue to be this anchor for our communities, but how do we create these opportunities for people to really be able to fulfill kind of their opportunities and hopes and dreams that they all have for themselves and their families, right? I mean, one of the things that I've worked on over the last few years before COVID-19 has been this idea of this family wealth forum that I do, where it's about building kind of family assets and other things. Not everybody has the opportunity to do that, but why shouldn't we try to figure out a way to help people to be able to build, right? And to be able to have the ability to weather the storm. I mean, I take a look at the statistics where we take a look at how much savings, you know, a typical person of color has versus someone who doesn't, and it's almost nothing. It's like $50 in a bank account to be able to weather the storm. You know, I just can't think that that is the way that we want to continue our society and our economic place. So, you know, I think that it is going to be it's going to be a hard road ahead in terms of the policies that we can think of, but I think that we need to be creative, and I'm hoping and looking to all of you and your leadership and your ideas to be able to bring forward to the task force through Michael, through Roma and others, so that we can make sure that we're considering all of them. And I think that this is going to be iterative. If we're going to continue to learn, we're going to continue to figure out how we can do this better. Because, you know, again, I think that we as San Francisco, we have to try to do better. We just do. There's too many people who are really hurt, and there is no reason why people should fear for their safety going out the street. There's no reason that people should not have something to eat or a roof over their heads. So anyway, thank you for your comments, Mario.
Thank you, Carmen, for your leadership, and thank you for this comprehensive report. I did want to let you know that following every one of our meetings that I have been reporting back to the faith leaders of San Francisco, I have been steering them to the links on the Economic Recovery Task Force, and we will continue to do that. I think this in particular will be very enlightening for so very many of them. So I want to thank you and the preparation and the time you've given us today. It's been a gift. And I want to thank our panelists as well. Allow me also to thank Cynthia Zambucas in our office, without whom I don't think I would have the capacity to be able to continue doing this, as well as our Joint Information Center team, John McKnight, Kristen Lane, who will be leaving us, who's been with us for 8 weeks, Trey Russell, Alan, who will be picking up with Chris Sindabath, and Sharon Walton. Next week, we are awaiting confirmation, but we hope to be welcoming Dr. Tomas Aragon to discuss with us revisions to the public health order, which will allow congregations to reopen. I know that that is going to be a question of great interest and concern, and we hope that he can shed some light on that. At this point, I just want to turn back to John McKnight to say a quick word about citywide testing. John?
I'm here. There we go. And good afternoon, everybody. Good morning. Yes. I know what time of day it is. There is free testing to the residents of the people of San Francisco and workers coming into the city. If you show signs of COVID, and perhaps even if you don't, please go to City Test SF. Get tested. Find out how easy it is to do this so that the day comes that you or a family member find yourselves concerned, you already know how to do it. Please go get yourselves tested. City Test SF, free testing here in the city of San Francisco, and for all the agencies that made that possible, our gratitude. Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next week. This concludes our program for the day.
Thank you.
Okay.